the spring of 1880, two brick masons, Morgan and Brown, stopped at our quarters in Ysleta, on their way from Fort Craig, New Mexico, to San Antonio, Texas. They had heard that some freight wagons at San Elizario would soon return to San Antonio and were anxious to travel back with them. These men spent 2 or 3 days in the ranger camp and seemed very nice chaps and pleasant talkers. One of them, Mr. Morgan, owned one of the finest pistols I ever saw. It was pearl-handled and silver-mounted. Our boys tried to trade for it, but Morgan would not part with the weapon. After the 2 men had been gone from our camp 3 or 4 days, word was brought to Lieutenant Baylor that 2 men had been found dead near San Elizario. The lieutenant sent me with a detail of 3 rangers to investigate. At San Elizario, we learned that the dead men were at Collins' sheep ranch, 4 miles from town. On arriving there, we found to our surprise and horror that the dead men were Morgan and Brown, who had left our camp hale and hearty just a few days before. It was surmised that the men had camped for the night at the sheep ranch and had been beaten to death with heavy mesquite sticks. They had been dead 2 or 3 days and were stripped of their clothing, their bodies being partly eaten by coyotes. On repairing to his sheep ranch, Mr. Collins found the dead bodies of Morgan and his shepherds gone, and his flocks scattered over the country. Mr. Collins gave the herders names as Santiago Skevel and Manuel Moleno. After beating out the brains of their unfortunate victims, the Mexicans robbed the bodies and lit out for parts unknown. As the murderers were on foot and had been gone 3 or 4 days, I found it very difficult to get their trail, as loose stock grazed along the bosques and partially obliterated it. As there was a number of settlements and several little pueblos along the river, I knew if I did not follow the Mexicans' tracks closely, I could never tell where they had gone. So I spent the remainder of the day trying to get the trail from camp. We were compelled to follow it on foot, leading our horses. We would sometimes be an hour trailing a mile. On the following day, I was able to make only 10 miles on the trail, but I had discovered the general direction. I slept on the banks of the Rio Grande that night, and next morning crossed into Mexico and found that the murderers were going down the river in the direction of Guadalupe. I now quit the trail and hurried on to this little Mexican town. Traveling around a short bend in the road, I came suddenly into the main street of Guadalupe, and almost the first man I saw standing on the street was a Mexican with Morgan's white-handled pistol strapped on him. I left 2 of my men to watch the suspect, and myself hurried to the office of the president of Guadalupe, made known my mission, and told him I had seen one of the supposed murderers of Morgan and Brown on the streets of his city, and asked that the suspect be arrested. The official treated me very cordially and soon had some police officers go with me. They found the 2 suspected Mexicans, arrested them and placed them in the jail. The prisoners admitted they were Collins's sheep herders and said their names were Moleno and Skevel, but of course, denied knowing anything about the death of Morgan and Brown. All my rangers recognized the pistol taken from the Mexican as the weapon owned by Mr. Morgan. The Mexican officers reported to the town president that the suspects had been arrested. The latter official then asked me if I had any papers for these men. I told him I did not, for at the time I left my camp at Ysleta, we did not know the nature of the murder or the names of the parties incriminated. I declared I was sure the men arrested had committed the murder and that I would hurry back to Ysleta and have the proper papers issued for the prisoner's extradition. He promised to hold the suspects until the proper formalities could be complied with. From Guadalupe to Ysleta is about 50 or 60 miles. I felt the importance of the case, and while I and my men were footsore and weary, we rode all night long over a sandy road and reached camp at Ysleta at 9 o'clock the following morning. Lieutenant Baylor at once appeared before the Justice of the Peace at Ysleta and filed a complaint of murder against Manuel Moleno and Santiago Skevel, had warrants issued for their arrest, and himself hurried to El Paso, crossed the river to El Paso del Norte, and, presenting his warrants to the authorities, asked that the murderers be held until application for their extradition could be made. Within a week we learned, much to our disgust, that the 2 murderers had been liberated and told to vamoose. I doubt whether the warrants were ever sent to the alcalde at Guadalupe. A more cruel murder than that of Morgan and Brown was never committed on the Rio Grande, yet the murderers went scot-free. This miscarriage of justice rankled in my memory, and subsequently, it was to lead me to take the law into my own hands. When dealing with another Mexican murderer, James B. Gillett, Texas Ranger.